everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to have the opportunity to share a little bit of a story, I guess, in terms of how myself and colleagues in the west of England have been working to try and support a sustainable approach to drainage. As Mike says, I've been seconded on a part-time basis to Bristol City Council, and they've been working with their neighbours very much on trying to work out how to make this work. I first started in Bristol City in a rather frantic commission in January around this time last year, very quickly trying to get ready for an April commencement of Schedule 3. Obviously, very shortly after I started, the deadline moved to October, and we actually started to be able to give some more clear thinking to what actually needs to happen. And really, I suppose for those who don't know the area, sorry, I'm not quite sure where Wales has gone. I actually live in Wales, but anyway, Bristol, it's the former Avon, for those people who know the area from a few years ago, former Avon Authority, so Bristol in the middle, South Gloucestershire to the north, North Somerset to the south, and Bath and North East Somerset to the east. And they work as a partnership. There's a number of different ways in which they work closely, trying to align. Actually, this comes out of planning, really, trying to align how their different planning authorities work. They're all unitary authorities, which do make things obviously a little bit simpler. So it's just down the corridor rather than a drive to a different organisation to have a conversation about planning if you're a drainage person. But actually, we have had Somerset County Council join us as well, which gives a slightly different perspective. I think really the focus which we've been trying to give is really around promoting sustainable drainage. I mean, at the end of the day, as I'm sure the collective experience in the room will only testify, sustainable drainage is really, really simple. It is not really complicated engineering. It's frankly a lot easier than conventional drainage in many ways. What is difficult is the fact that for several centuries we've been working within conventional drainage pipe networks, and our legislative environment reflects that. And so really, West of England and Bristol City Council have been trying to promote a focus on sustainable drainage and really to provide some clarity to developers and designers in terms of what is actually needed. What do you need to do to get your site through to being constructed? And we recognise that uncertainty, and after, I think you're right, 5 years, I've been getting used to saying 4 years, but 5 years of uncertainty, clarity is something which is a real important point. We're also very keen to have consistency. I've talked about how the four authorities have tried to share practice in terms of how they approach the charging formulas for pre-applications, for example. All those sort of little details, trying to give a bit of consistency so that the developer community ultimately know what to expect, even if the actual details may be slightly different depending on the authority. And as I say, because it's simple, there's lots of good practice out there. Some faces in the room I've seen who I know have done some excellent work in the area, and as I say, it's around just trying to link people together. One of the particular sort of drivers which we felt was there's that sort of smaller scale developer, the developer which maybe has one or two sites, maybe doesn't have access to the very large sort of consultancies or the highly specialised consultants. And really it's around trying to be able to share best practice and educate. So in terms of barriers, we were thinking around this time last year and a bit before around what are the key things, what are the key tools that we can give to try to help make this happen. And one of the things which came again and again was around having local guidance. I had one slide which I've actually taken out, which had just lots and lots of front covers of guidance documents with sustainable drainage. If anybody's ever printed out all the sustainable drainage guidance documents, I think we're almost up to a foot of paper. There is so much guidance out there, and if you are a doer, if you're somebody who has to actually use it, sometimes it's actually quite hard to see, I don't know, wood for the trees, whatever the term is. And so really it was around trying to have a signposting to where you need to go, what is the really key bits of useful gems. And I have to say, sort of, Mike did some excellent sort of queuing up for what I was going to say here, because actually the South East 7 guidance document for master planning we think is brilliant. And so we've just signposted to it. Thanks, Bronwyn, for the permission. But it's a great document. Why try and reinvent something? It's already there. It's already done. Let's just signpost to it to a good point. And the key bits in that document, which are very relevant. One thing which I'm going to come back to a couple of times is proof of concept. It's an idea which we've had. I'd be really interested to hear what people's feedback is on it today. It's an idea which we've had, which we've presented to our planning community, our developer community, and it's something which I think has been quite well received. And it's a tool which we as a local authority, on behalf of a local authority, feel is a way of enabling what Mike was talking about, having a thought about drainage and the opportunities drainage presents from the start. We also spent a bit of time trying to develop some case studies. The target audience is not a technical audience. I have to say we sent it to Suzanne in Syria. She's come back with a list of things we need to answer in terms of the technical details. It's a non-technical case study. It's trying to present where around Bristol and the west of England SuDS is working and has worked for, in some instances, several decades. We're also trying to raise awareness and capacity building. And we're also working now very actively on clarifying the approach and what the different positions of different authorities and organisations are in relation to the maintenance of, dare I say it, shared SuDS. So, West of England Guide. It is emerging, it is preliminary. I've got a copy here. It has the words preliminary draft stamped very firmly on it. It was written by all four or five local authorities, with a colleague of mine, Paul Davis, and myself, sort of trying to pull together the different constituent parts. And it was written in, dare I say it, August and September. So there are a number of sort of elements which need to be updated, but it was written as interim. It was written to be something to allow the developers to have a soft launch to what we thought was Schedule 3 going to be. And so it was written with a view that we were going to be working within the current planning arrangement. Now it looks like our interim arrangement actually can, with a very small amount of changes, be made into the permanent arrangement. It's been a collaborative effort. It's been involving not just the local authorities but also the internal drainage boards. We have several in our area, Wessex Water, our sewerage undertaker, and the local environment agency. As I've said, it's around signposting to policy and other good guidance. It's following, for those in the water industry, probably the best example is the sewage for adoption approach. There's an overarching sub-region, Section 1, and then authority-specific Section 2s, which deal with the local context and local requirements if there are any. And it's really around building on existing planning policy and around building on local flood risk management strategies. It's split up into 4 areas. It's, as it says, sort of how, what, why, how and when. And it's trying to be as frankly as simple as possible. So, Mike's done an excellent job at talking about how sometimes, dare I say it, drainage is something which is thought of at quite a late stage in the development planning process and design process. And so we were thinking as authorities, what can we do about it? This is our attempt, which is, we've called it a proof of concept. And a proof of concept really is a term which has been used to discussions which probably on quite a lot of developments already happen. Those discussions are really around understanding what the constraints that surface water drainage places on that development. If you speak to the developer community, fluvial and tidal flood risk is actually something which is on people's minds from the start. People don't, they've actually taken on board the fact that it's not something which can be, dare I say it, negotiated. You know, I am in flood zone, whatever. Surface water drainage hasn't got that, and we think that's a real problem. It's also completely unrealistic to expect that a developer with a cash flow is going to be able to appoint a drainage engineer at the start to be able to work through lots and lots of detail on perhaps on a speculative development where there may not be opportunity to actually move this forwards into later stages. So what we were keen to do was, based on a constraints plan, have all the key constraints that surface water places to be out in the open up front. So we have blue corridors where water would naturally flow where we also have the discharge or maintenance requirements. So if there are particular restrictions to site, perhaps, for example, there is a particular downstream community at risk of flooding, maybe the sewerage network has capacity issues, maybe there's all manner of issues which perhaps the internal drainage board may present. There may be particular maintenance requirements. Perhaps the watercourse needs a particular arrangement to be able to clear trash screen, or whatever the details are. And we feel this is something which actually fits very nicely into, ideally it would be perhaps even earlier than pre-application stage, but it fits into the pre-application format. It's something which would be led by the local planning authority, clearly with the involvement of all the risk management authorities, like the lead local flood authority, like the Environment Agency if they are involved from a watercourse perspective, or the internal drainage board, and of course, if necessary, the water company. It would be voluntary, like the pre-application. It would be proportionate. Clearly, if you've got a very large site, it could be quite an extensive amount of work. For a small site, it could be simply one drawing. Our initial feedback has been positive, both from from planners, from the developer community. They see it promotes discussion at an early stage, and ultimately, for a developer, it reduces the risk. The worst thing I imagine would be that you get to quite an advanced stage and you find actually, there's a fundamental constraint that's going to cause you a big problem. So, proof of concept. The second thing which we've got, which I think is quite interesting, is around how do you do SuDS? And we've tried to focus this around what was then the draft June 2014 national standards, which were then the annex in the September consultation. And we've just reflected them, repeated them here, because some of the developer community hadn't necessarily been on to, dare I say it, Paul, the SuStrains website, or, I know, cheeky, just really sort of trying to bring it all together, all the key references, bring them together. And I have to say that the standards, there's a tremendous amount of work clearly gone into them. And they do cover, ultimately, quite, key sort of topic areas. They are broad, they are open to interpretation. And so in some instances, and I've just put up two as a very sort of sample, just to sort of show that, in the case of standard 3, in the particular West of England area, then the condition is unlikely to be applicable, and a little bit of detail as to how the local authorities would expect greenfield run-up rates to be calculated. Feedback has been positive. It's trying to have a consistency of approach. So that was the section 1. Then we've got the section 2s. The section 2s are, as I say, specific to each local authority. The section 2s are written by a number of different local authorities, and I think North Somerset and Bristol have both finished preliminary drafts, and the other 3 are in different stages. Bristol's actually taken quite an interesting approach. They've tried to identify 8 vision statements, which they sort of are really trying to promote to the developer community. I'll just take 2. Blue-green corridors. They're very, very keen on blue-green corridors and keen to emphasise them, and I'm sure it's something which resonates with anyone who has an interest in green infrastructure and with sustainable drainage. Trying to hammer home the fact that these are things which really add to a development and should be thought of from the start. And in Bristol, as you can appreciate, it's a highly urbanised area, so it's something which needs some thought to actually apply not to this wonderful greenfield ideal master plan site, but to the infill brownfield development. How do you apply the blue-green corridor approach to a previously developed site? Source control. Source control really is the fundamental, isn't it, in terms of sustainable drainage. You try and manage water where it lands, and then you have to deal with what's left over. And sometimes that's something which takes a little bit of thinking about, particularly if you've been used to conventional drainage, particularly if you're a developer who's been doing it for a number of years, you're used to how you do things. And so Bristol has really tried to focus in on the key vision statements which they see as being the enablers for sustainable drainage. The other thing which Bristol's done in their section 2, and I have to say that Bristol's different to North Somerset. North Somerset have had, they've approached it in a slightly different way because they're different geographies. They're a far more rural area, and Bristol lends itself perhaps better to this. So it's not necessarily one size fits all. but it's just an example really. The observation which Bristol's made is that the strategic drivers for surface water drainage vary across the city, which is a pretty obvious statement, I'm sure, but you can actually try and group together areas broadly. So there are areas in Bristol, dare I say it, where infiltration really there isn't much potential. There's always a little bit, but there's not a great deal of potential. In other areas there is. Some areas of Bristol are very close to tidally drained watercourses, and in those locations actually attenuating perhaps isn't necessarily the best drainage strategy. Now all of this information, I'm sure any drainage engineer and any expert, many of you in the room I'm sure will know this and understand this instantly, but to a developer, perhaps somebody who's got only one site, this is their site, or maybe a couple of sites, this may be news, may be new. And every site varies and everything needs a site-specific consideration, but this is around trying to point people towards where they should be thinking at the start. So for example, in the central area of Bristol, around the floating harbour, for those of you who know Bristol at all, floating harbour, the clue's in the name obviously, harbour, tidal. Here really it's water quality that's really important. Water quantity and the speed which it gets out, actually the quicker it gets out the better, so it doesn't end up compounding flows later. So in this particular area, in this particular zone, you can see at the bottom here we've got water quality mitigation and improvements, a real sort of driver in the area, and seeking to reduce the impact on the combined sewer network which serves that part of the city. And it then sort of expands on what the evidence is for that area, and each area of Bristol has the same. So as I say, it's just a little example, a little bit of a flavour for how we've tried to signpost and point people towards where they should be thinking. Moving on, case studies. SuDS website has an excellent collection of really interesting and useful and thought-provoking case studies. If you haven't had a look, I'd really encourage you to. And if you've got any things that you want to sort of promote, then put your site forwards. In Bristol, there are a couple on the SuDS website, but there aren't that many. And as I think I may have already said, we really wanted to show people, demystify what SuDS is. And there's nothing better than actually going to see one of these things that, a highways engineer, if you tell them what a swale is, they'll end up getting very, very scared. But if you show them it, it's actually not that scary. So we had, fortunately, some colleagues in our sustainability team who had put together some non-technical case studies in 2009. And now, sort of 5 years later, we have 5 years worth of operation to learn from, which we wanted to capture as well. So we have these 19 case studies, which include the larger sites with your ponds and attenuation features, your permeable paving, through to Bristol Auditorium, where it's an absolutely constrained site, and designers there have had to use quite an interesting blue roof. And really, what we're trying to do is just, so that when people are thinking about sustainable drainage, when our planners are talking to people about sustainable drainage, they know where actually you can go and see, and you can talk to somebody who has sustainable drainage. So we spent a bit of time thinking about how do we build awareness and how do we get some feedback from people, because there's nothing worse than somebody sitting in a black box writing some lovely guidance documents and then actually it being released and everyone ignores it. And so what we did was we felt that having an engagement event and giving the opportunity to get as much feedback as possible from those who would be using the guidance would be a really good way of approaching it. Now, I apologise, it's not meant to be complicated at all. It was just trying to show how local built environment professionals thought of in terms of themselves, how much understanding do they have of sustainable drainage, whether they saw SuDS as an opportunity, and whether they felt that within their organisation they actually had the capacity to do sustainable drainage. And all that this tries to show is that everybody sort of thought that SuDS was either part or very much an opportunity, that there was a full range of people in terms of their understanding, and that in terms of the capacity to do it, it did depend on the site, which doesn't sound that silly. But we really did come back to the fact that there was a full range of understanding, which has kind of really helped us in terms of understanding our target audience for the guide itself. So we took that and we used that to tailor an event which we held in December. So the event was arranged through our local planning authorities who have user groups, so people who, agents and designers and developers who frequently use the planning authority. And it allowed us to really try and actually have a bit of a discussion with quite a mix of people. I have to say I would have liked the developer segment to be slightly more, but there was a good mix of people in the room. There was about 80 or so people, and it was really around being able to have the assistant mayor giving sort of a vision as Bristol as green capital for this European green capital, and really why are we trying to do SuDS, through to us being able to present the guide itself, the preliminary draft guide, and for us to be able to hear from other speakers about, dare I say, the key issues, cost, and we had representation from WSP from their work with DEFRA, looking at the comparative costs of SuDS and the fact that for a developer SuDS is cheaper, and this really sort of was a really great event to be able to really bring people together and think about SuDS itself. And obviously we are now looking at having a further engagement event, hoping to increase the segment for developers, and really looking to build on the discussions which we started. We've also had some internal and awareness raising events itself. So in terms of what's next, just to kind of bring things to a close, obviously the November preliminary draft West of England guide needs to be updated now that DCLG have made their ministerial announcement, and so we're very fortunate, I suppose. We hadn't really realised how good our timing was going to be on this, but so the guide's going to be issued in March. We're working very closely with internal drainage boards, water companies, and within colleagues within the local authorities to be able to understand where the opportunities are to be able to give clarity on approach to maintenance of shared SuDS. I have to say we haven't necessarily found the answers. We've done some research looking at different approaches from around the country. There's many people in the room actually, faces who I've spoken to, and I really appreciate the time which you've taken to share your thoughts and good practice. I found some really interesting examples. Some are slightly unique. As an example, Milton Keynes, where obviously they have existing charitable trusts which have been set up as part of Milton Keynes starting up, looking after very large surface water features, and so therefore they have quite an established approach for maintenance of sustainable drainage. There's some quite interesting approaches in the north of England, where we have management companies which have perhaps on their board of directors members of the local community, members of the council, environment agency, have very heavy involvements in the management companies of these drainage areas, drainage features. And we've also come across councils who have found a way of using existing legislation to adopt by agreement with an annual service charge on those properties which are served by the sustainable drainage feature. And if there are any more good examples, please grab me at the end or drop me an email, because I really would love to hear from you. And as Paul keeps on nagging me, I'm overdue to give a fact sheet on this, so I'll try to, Paul, tomorrow. So I hope that sort of gives a little bit of a flavour for how a collection of local authorities in the west of England have tried to make things work. We haven't got all the answers. We've got quite a lot of work to do, like I'm sure everybody has. I think that we were quite lucky in the sense that we had taken a view that we wanted to get something there just to go with, even if Schedule 3 wasn't going to come in. And it just so happens that now that is very easy to transpose into what happens after April. But I hope that gives a bit of an interest, and we're now starting work with with Birmingham City Council, exactly the same sort of approach. So I'm sure there's lessons to be passed on from that. Anyway, thank you very much.